Ethan, Chris, and Derek were three high school students bound by one teacher, Sarah, a beloved figure who seemed to care for them like no one else. But what began as innocent admiration soon spiraled into obsession, jealousy, and rivalry. In a quiet town where trust was everything, no one could have predicted that Sarah's emotional manipulation would lead these three boys down a deadly path, ultimately ending in murder. Sarah Lawson had always been the kind of teacher everyone admired. She had a warm smile, an open door, and an uncanny ability to make even the most difficult subjects feel approachable. To the students at Riverton High School, she was a mentor, someone who not only cared about their academic success but also their personal well-being. She'd stay after school, offering extra help to anyone who asked, making time to connect with students who seemed to be struggling with life outside of the classroom. No one had any reason to doubt her sincerity. Ethan, Chris, and Derek were three boys in her senior English class who seemed to stand out. Ethan was quiet, always sitting at the back of the room, sketching in his notebook while trying to avoid eye contact with anyone. His grades were decent, but he often seemed lost in his own world, as though he didn't quite fit in. Chris, on the other hand, was popular. A football player, confident and athletic, he had the attention of many students. He was friendly, but there was always an underlying pressure. His parents had high expectations for him to succeed both on and off the field, and he could never quite escape that weight. Then there was Derek, the troubled one, always on edge, constantly in trouble with school authorities. Derek's home life was chaotic. His family was falling apart, and it showed in the way he acted at school, defensive, angry, and looking for an outlet for his frustrations. Sarah, being the empathetic teacher that she was, took notice of these three boys. She saw that they were struggling in different ways. Ethan, with his quiet demeanor and artistic soul, clearly needed someone to notice him. Sarah began to ask him questions, giving him small assignments that played to his strengths, encouraging him to share his art with the class. Slowly, she began to see the creative mind behind the shy exterior. Chris, though outgoing, had an edge to him, something hidden beneath the surface that Sarah could sense. The pressure he felt at home was starting to take a toll, and she made a point of talking to him after class, reminding him that his worth was not defined by anyone's expectations except his own. As for Derek, she noticed his struggle even more acutely. His anger and defiance were his way of coping with the mess of his life at home. Sarah tried to reach out, offering him small bits of encouragement, letting him know that he wasn't alone. But what Sarah didn't realize was that her attention, though seemingly harmless and kind, was planting seeds in each of the boys' minds. They began to crave her approval, each in their own way. Ethan, who had always been isolated, now found himself drawn to Sarah's quiet support, believing that maybe, for once, someone saw him for who he really was. Chris, always competing for attention, saw in Sarah the validation he didn't get from his parents, and Derek, desperate for any kind of affirmation, began to rely on Sarah more than he ever had anyone else. Her mentorship became the lifeline they never knew they needed, but it also began to blur the lines of what was appropriate. Over time, Sarah's care began to take a more personal turn. She started offering private tutoring sessions, inviting the boys to her house for one-on-one help with schoolwork. She made sure each boy felt important and special, as if they were the only one who mattered. But the truth was, Sarah's motives weren't entirely innocent. She reveled in the power she had over these boys, the way they needed her, and the control it gave her in their lives. She told herself that she was simply helping, that she was offering them a safe space, but deep down, she knew she was crossing a line. What she didn't know, however, was just how far things would go and how destructive her decisions would ultimately be. As the months passed, the bond between Sarah and the three boys grew stronger. Each of them began to rely on her more and more, seeing her as not just a teacher but a confidante and something even more. What had started as a simple act of kindness, a teacher offering extra help, gradually transformed into something much more dangerous. Sarah never intended for it to happen, but her actions slowly fed into the boys' growing attachment to her. She didn't notice how the lines of professionalism blurred, nor how her subtle favoritism began to consume the boys, changing their once innocent admiration into something more complicated and unhealthy. Ethan, the quiet artist, had always been someone who shied away from attention. He'd never been particularly good at making friends or fitting in with his peers. But Sarah's attention made him feel seen, something he wasn't used to. Over time, he began to spend more time with her outside of class, seeking her guidance not only for his studies but also for his personal struggles. She encouraged him to share his artwork, praising his talent, and telling him that his creativity was something special. Ethan began to believe that he was unique because of her. Her words gave him the validation he had been missing, and he found himself longing for her approval more than he had ever anticipated. His heart began to beat faster whenever she smiled at him, and he felt a new sense of purpose when she was around. Chris, the popular football player, had always thrived on attention. He was used to being the center of his family's world, but the pressure from his parents to succeed was overwhelming. Sarah, noticing his anxiety, took the time to tell him that he didn't have to be perfect in order to be valued. She assured him that he was worth more than just his athletic ability. For Chris, her words were a relief, a reassurance he had never truly gotten from his parents. As their relationship deepened, he began to confide in her about the pressures he faced at home, sharing stories of arguments with his father and the weight of expectations. Sarah listened carefully, offering advice that made him feel understood. But as he spent more time with her, he began to feel an intense connection, one that went beyond the teacher-student dynamic. He found himself yearning for her company, a feeling he couldn't quite explain but couldn't push away either. Derek, the most troubled of the three, had always been volatile and angry. His home life was a mess, his parents divorced, and he felt like he had no one to turn to. Sarah noticed his frustration, his inability to focus in class, and began to offer him more individual attention. She told him that he wasn't defined by his mistakes, that he was capable of so much more than he gave himself credit for. She encouraged him to open up about his struggles, something Derek had never done with anyone. Slowly, Sarah became his emotional anchor, the one person who made him feel like his life wasn't a constant disaster. He began to crave her presence, her validation, and her understanding. With every private session, with every word of encouragement, Derek fell deeper into the idea that Sarah was the only person who truly understood him. But what Sarah didn't realize was that by giving each of the boys so much of her time, attention, and emotional support, she was weaving a tangled web of dependency. Ethan, Chris, and Derek each believed they were the ones Sarah favored most, that they were the ones she truly cared about. She had unknowingly planted the seeds of rivalry between them. What had started as a teacher offering guidance had morphed into a dangerous game of manipulation, with each boy desperate for Sarah's attention and approval. The lines of affection had blurred. What was meant to be a harmless teacher-student relationship had turned into something much more complicated. The jealousy between the boys grew, and their increasingly intense need for Sarah began to consume them. Sarah, though aware of the tensions between them, failed to see the dangerous consequences of her actions. She thought she was simply helping them navigate their struggles, but in reality she was pushing them into a spiral of obsession and competition. The foundation of trust that had once existed between them was eroding, and soon what had begun as an innocent affair of attention would become a destructive force that none of them could escape. What Sarah hadn't accounted for was how far the boys were willing to go for her affection, and how much the stakes had risen with every passing day. As the days turned into weeks, the tension among the three boys began to intensify. What had started as a friendly rivalry for Sarah's attention soon turned into something far more dangerous. Each of the boys had become convinced that Sarah cared for them more than the others, and they were willing to do anything to keep her focus on them. The subtle manipulations Sarah had made, encouraging their dependence on her, now began to backfire. What was once innocent admiration had evolved into obsession. The boys, once united in their shared struggles, had grown into rivals in a silent war for Sarah's affection. Ethan, the quiet and artistic one, was the first to feel the weight of the growing competition. He had always been sensitive, but now his emotions were heightened in a way he couldn't control. He began to see every little interaction between Sarah and the other boys as a threat. Every smile, every encouraging word that Sarah directed toward Chris or Derek felt like a betrayal. His insecurity, once hidden beneath layers of introversion, now consumed him. He became fixated on their interactions, convinced that Sarah was pulling away from him. When she would compliment Chris on his athleticism or Derek on his potential, Ethan would retreat further into himself, consumed with jealousy and confusion. He couldn't understand why he felt this way. But the more he thought about it, the more desperate he became to be the one Sarah turned to, the one she needed. Chris, on the other hand, was used to competition. He thrived on being the center of attention, and when it seemed like Sarah's time was split between him and the others, he couldn't handle it. Despite his outward confidence, the pressure from his parents to excel, particularly in sports, had made him feel like he could never truly meet their expectations. With Sarah, he felt valued for who he was, not just as an athlete but as a person. However, he couldn't shake the feeling that Derek, with his raw vulnerability and volatile emotions, had become Sarah's favorite. Derek had begun to open up more about his home life, and Sarah seemed to pay him more attention, offering him the support that Chris felt he had never received. This drove Chris to an edge he hadn't anticipated. The fear of losing Sarah's favor sent him spiraling. He grew impatient, becoming more demanding of her time and attention, convinced that if he just tried harder, Sarah would see that he was the one she truly cared about. Derek, the troubled one, had his own set of demons. The more time Sarah spent with him, the more he began to believe that he could escape the mess of his life through her. She became his refuge, the one person who made him feel understood. But Derek was also a ticking time bomb, and the emotions he had kept buried for so long began to spill out in unpredictable ways. He could sense the growing competition between the boys, and as much as he craved Sarah's approval, he couldn't stand seeing Ethan or Chris around her. They represented everything Derek felt he couldn't be: calm, composed, and capable. Sarah's affection had become a prize, and in his twisted view he was entitled to it. His growing resentment toward the other boys festered in silence, building up over time until it became something more dangerous than he could control. The more Sarah encouraged them, the more she set the stage for disaster. She was unaware of how deep the boys' feelings had grown, how the jealousy was quietly simmering beneath the surface. Her kindness, once a source of comfort, was now a battleground. Each boy was desperate to be the one Sarah chose, the one she needed, the one she couldn't live without, and none of them realized how far they were willing to go to make sure that happened. It was one fateful evening when everything finally came to a head. The three boys, each consumed by their need for Sarah's validation, met at her house under the pretense of resolving their differences. Each of them walked in with a mask of civility, pretending that everything was fine, but beneath the surface, the tension was unbearable. The conversation started out innocent enough: small talk about their studies, their futures, but it didn't take long for the simmering jealousy to boil over. Accusations flew, each boy blaming the others for taking too much of Sarah's attention, each one claiming to be the most important to her. Words turned into shoves, and before anyone could stop it, the confrontation escalated into a physical fight. In the heat of the struggle, Derek, always the most unpredictable, grabbed a knife from the kitchen. What had begun as a heated argument spiraled into chaos. The knife cut through the air as emotions overtook reason. Ethan and Chris tried to stop Derek, but in the frenzy, Chris was stabbed. His body crumpled to the floor, the blood spilling out in a pool that stained the carpet beneath him. The sight of it snapped the boys into reality, but it was too late. They had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. In their panic, they made the fateful decision to leave Chris behind, knowing that what had started as a rivalry for Sarah's affection had ended in something much darker. They fled the scene, leaving behind the consequences of their actions, unaware of the trail of destruction they had left in their wake. The discovery of Chris's body sent shockwaves through Riverton High School and the small town. The sense of unease began to permeate the community, especially as the investigation into his sudden disappearance unfolded. At first, the authorities believed Chris had run away or gotten into some kind of trouble, but as days passed without any leads, the case took a darker turn. His friends, classmates, and teachers were baffled. No one knew where Chris had gone, and his absence left a void that no one could explain. Sarah was in complete denial. When the police arrived to question her, she feigned confusion and distress, claiming that she had no idea where Chris could be. She insisted that everything had been fine with him in class, that he had no reason to leave, and that they had only spoken briefly about school matters in the days leading up to his disappearance. She kept up this charade of innocence, not knowing that the investigation was beginning to uncover disturbing truths about her involvement with the three boys. The police began by speaking to Ethan, Chris's closest friend in class. At first, Ethan was too shaken to offer much information, his words coming out in fragmented sentences as he tried to process what had happened. His mind was a whirlwind of guilt and fear. He had been one of the last people to see Chris alive, and his alibi seemed flimsy at best. The investigators weren't convinced. They pressed him harder, trying to get him to admit something, anything. The more Ethan thought about the night, the more his mind became clouded with his own feelings of guilt. He had tried to stop the fight with Derek, but in the chaos he had frozen, too scared to intervene effectively. The investigators' suspicions grew when they spoke to Derek. He was unpredictable, an enigma to everyone who knew him. His history of trouble and his volatile emotions made him a prime suspect, but Derek's story kept changing. He was initially calm, even indifferent, when questioned, but as the conversation deepened, he became more erratic. His statements were inconsistent, and when the police asked him about his whereabouts on the night of Chris's death, he hesitated, stammered, and finally claimed he didn't remember. It was clear to the investigators that he was hiding something, but it wasn't until they reviewed the footage from Sarah's living room that the truth started to take shape. The footage, captured by a discreet security camera in Sarah's home, showed everything: the boys entering the house, their heated argument, and the escalating violence. It was chilling. The camera had captured not only the confrontation but the moment when Derek, in a fit of rage, grabbed the knife. The police watched in horror as Chris was fatally injured. In that moment, the boys realized they had gone too far, but it was too late. The raw panic and fear on their faces were unmistakable. The footage was the smoking gun, the piece of evidence that tied them directly to the crime scene. The police wasted no time in arresting Ethan and Derek. They couldn't be certain of Sarah's direct involvement in Chris's death, but the evidence against the boys was overwhelming. As the investigation continued, Sarah found herself under increasing scrutiny. The more the police dug into the relationships between Sarah and her students, the more they began to uncover. It wasn't just the murder of Chris that was concerning, it was the web of manipulation and emotional dependence Sarah had woven around these boys. Sarah's personal emails, which were uncovered during the investigation, were damning. They revealed that Sarah had been fueling the boys' emotions, subtly encouraging their jealousy and rivalry without directly acknowledging it. She had played on their insecurities, made them feel like they were the only ones who mattered to her, and fed their growing obsession with her. As the evidence mounted, it became clear that Sarah had played a dangerous game, one that had ended in tragedy. The revelation of the boys' involvement, combined with Sarah's manipulation, turned the investigation from a missing persons case into something much darker. While Derek and Ethan were arrested and charged with Chris's murder, Sarah was not immediately taken into custody. But the police had a plan. They needed to gather more evidence to fully expose her role in the events leading up to the murder. They knew Sarah had manipulated the boys, and they knew she had fostered the toxic environment that led to the violence, but they needed her to admit it. The case was about to take a turn that no one saw coming, and the full extent of Sarah's actions was about to be revealed to the world. As the investigation continued, the community was left in disbelief. Riverton High, once a school full of hopeful students and teachers, now found itself grappling with the consequences of a betrayal that no one could have anticipated. The repercussions of Sarah's actions would leave a scar on the town, one that would be impossible to heal. The once trusted teacher, who had seemingly had the best interests of her students at heart, was now at the center of a murder investigation that would rock the community to its core. The day Sarah was finally arrested, it felt like the entire town of Riverton had held its breath for weeks, waiting for the inevitable. The investigation had dragged on longer than anyone had anticipated, but now, with the truth laid bare, there was no more running from what had happened. The image of Sarah, the beloved teacher who had been both a mentor and a source of comfort to her students, had been shattered. Her fall from grace was both swift and devastating. What had once seemed like an innocent act of compassion had spiraled into a web of manipulation, obsession, and ultimately murder. The evidence against Sarah was overwhelming. The emails, the footage, and the testimony of the boys themselves painted a damning picture. Derek and Ethan, though initially reluctant, had begun to crack under the weight of their guilt. Their confessions, though laden with remorse, only deepened the sense of betrayal the town felt. They described how Sarah had nurtured their need for her approval, encouraged their dependency on her, and even played on their emotions to keep them vying for her attention. They admitted that they had never planned to hurt Chris, but in the heat of the moment, the rivalry and jealousy had overtaken them. The truth was that Sarah had been the catalyst for their actions, even if she hadn't directly encouraged violence. She had fostered an environment where their feelings for her had festered into something dangerous. Sarah's arrest was a surreal moment for those who had once viewed her as a role model. Many of her colleagues were left reeling, unable to reconcile the woman they had worked alongside for years with the person who had now been revealed to be at the center of such a tragedy. Some believed that she had truly wanted to help her students, that her intentions had been misguided but never malicious. Others, however, felt the weight of her manipulation more acutely, seeing how her actions had turned 3 boys into pawns in a deadly game. There was no longer any room for ambiguity. Sarah had crossed a line, and now the consequences of her choices were playing out in full view of the public. In the weeks that followed, the community struggled to come to terms with the events that had unfolded. Riverton High School, once a place of learning and safety, became a symbol of broken trust. The students, particularly those in Sarah's class, found themselves grappling with the reality that their beloved teacher had been anything but what they thought. For many, the hardest part was accepting that someone they had admired, someone they had trusted, was capable of such manipulation. The boys, who had been so influenced by Sarah's attention, now had to face the weight of their actions. They were left to reconcile their feelings of guilt and shame with the reality of the irreversible damage they had caused. As Sarah sat in her jail cell, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. She had lost everything: her career, her reputation, and her freedom. In the days leading up to her trial, she remained silent, her once confident demeanor replaced by a quiet resignation. She knew that the case against her was strong, and any defense she might offer would sound hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence. She had manipulated the boys, yes, but did that justify what had happened? Could she have foreseen how far things would go? Would it have made a difference if she had drawn clearer boundaries, if she had taken a step back and recognized the danger she was creating? These were the questions that haunted her as she prepared for the trial that would determine her fate. The trial itself was a media frenzy. Sarah's actions were analyzed and dissected by the public, her motivations picked apart by pundits and commentators. The defense tried to argue that Sarah had never meant for things to spiral out of control, that her involvement in the boys' lives had been well-intentioned, but the prosecution painted a much darker picture. The jury deliberated for days, but it was clear that the weight of Sarah's manipulations, the way she had encouraged emotional dependency and rivalry, would be difficult to ignore. In the end, Sarah was convicted on multiple charges, including manslaughter and emotional manipulation, and sentenced to prison. For Ethan, Derek, and Chris, the aftermath of the trial was a long road of self-reflection and regret. Though the court had placed the blame squarely on Sarah's shoulders, the boys knew they were far from innocent. Their rivalry, their jealousy, their willingness to go too far, all of it had led to a tragedy they could never undo. As the years passed, they would carry the weight of that night with them, knowing that their actions had forever changed the course of their lives. The town of Riverton would never be the same. The events surrounding Sarah's affair with her students and the murder of Chris had shattered the illusion of safety that had once defined the community. It was a cautionary tale that no one would forget, a reminder of how easily lines could be blurred, and how destructive the need for validation could become. As for Sarah, her story became a haunting example of how good intentions could go horribly wrong, and how a single moment of weakness could unravel everything.